Hi, I'm Joan Gore, and I am on behalf of the Association of International Education Administrators conducting a series of archival interviews, and archival is a good word because that's what will happen to them. It has nothing to do with our age, of people who are approaching the retirement age, maybe not yet retiring, but beginning to think about it in the field of international education, so that we can develop a body of material that will allow future researchers to understand what the arc of change has been in this latter half of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. We have a wonderful guest for this archival project today. It's Dr. Stephen Dunnett, who is, and I'm going to read this to get his title correctly, the Vice Provost for International Education and Professor of Foreign Language Education at the University of Buffalo, part of the State University of New York system. So Stephen, tell us a little bit about what you do now. And I know you are not near retirement. You're not planning yet to retire, but you're in the process of capstoning a great career. And so if you could, just a little bit about what you do now, and then we'll go back.
Sure. Well, I'm the Chief International Education Officer at University of Buffalo. So my portfolio includes all the areas that you would well understand. Study abroad, of course, exchanges with overseas institutions of higher education, incoming international students. We have about 5,200 international students, and scholars, about 500 scholars at any one time. I'm also responsible for our overseas projects such as Branch Campus in Singapore and a variety of teaching centers, mostly in Asia, China, Japan, Taiwan, and so on. The internationalization of the curriculum and immigration services for both international students as well as foreign faculty, or what we still call foreign faculty, and international staff, that's people on H visas, and setting general policy in the area of international education and international relations.
Your career encompasses all things essentially that are part of international education, which does not always happen in many institutions. And the fact that you can impact policy also reflects the development of support and respect for the field of international education that certainly did not exist when I began in my career. How was it when you began?
Well,
where did you begin?
Yes, sure. Well, actually, I began at the University of Buffalo. I came there in 1971 as an assistant professor. I didn't expect to quite be where I am today. So at that time, and I still am a professor in the School of Education, and so my field was sort of applied linguistics and largely TESOL and the training of foreign language teachers. And so at that time, international education was, I think, sort of on the periphery of the academic core of the university. It was mostly related to pastoral care for international students, or foreign students as they were called at that time. And study abroad, of course, was there, but it was largely done by faculty or in College of Arts and Letters and places like that. There was no centralization of international education services, and certainly there were no positions like the one I hold today on the provostal level. And actually, speaking for myself, I don't think I had such a strong interest at that time. I was much more interested in, getting tenure and being promoted and so on. And so I was more interested in the academic side. But when I came there, I helped establish a center for international students, what we would call today an Intensive English Institute. And because we were just starting then to get significant numbers of international students in the SUNY system, and the idea was to have a couple of regional centers, one in upstate New York where I was and one in downstate. And so they wanted to centralize this. The centralization never happened, but at any rate that was the thinking. And so I had experience in that area, and so I established that center. And we started working with Fulbright and various other sponsored programs. And that was when I began to see that it's more than just acquiring proficiency in English,
Right.
and that there were a lot of other issues that were related to, you know, the general adaptation of the students who came. And that's when I became interested in my colleagues who were the foreign student advisors.
Right.
And I began to get some insights into some of the issues that they were dealing with. So, and it moved on from there. So, but let me just say something about how I began to see international education at that time. It was largely, well, it was peripheral to the academic thrust of the institution. The level of professionalism of persons who worked in that area was relatively low, and I don't mean, you know, to criticize them in any way, because they were good people, but it was not considered a profession as
Right.
quite as it is today. In fact, at Buffalo, most of the people working in that area, many of them were volunteers, people from the community who had an interest in international students, and on the state civil service side where people worked, they didn't even have at that time positions that could be identified as, you know, working with in international education. And there was a very sort of, well, there was a lot of altruism then that I don't see today, so jumping
That's interesting.
forward, yeah. People did things because they were genuinely interested. Many of the ESL teachers we recruited at that time were returned Peace Corps folks and volunteers, and they had a deep interest in other cultures. Many of them were fluent in other languages, and they wanted a place, you know, where they could continue to do what they had,
Right.
you know, done overseas. And so they gravitated towards working with international students on the campus. And they were not the standards. In fact, well, I already told you, it was 1971. So TOEFL was just in its
Right.
infancy at that time. And even in admissions side, there were not a lot of the, you know, the understandings of credentials evaluation and the kind of things that we take for granted today that make our field, you know, very professional, but they were not there then. And I think in 72 or 73, I went to my first NAFSA conference, and I saw it was largely dominated by foreign student advisors and a lot of volunteers. They had even a section called ComSec, if you remember that. That were,
Yes, I do remember
It's people from
that.
the community who
Right.
gave a lot of their time to
Has that gone
programs.
by the
It's
wayside?
gone, yes, it's gone.
That's so
Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah. So I saw the spirit of volunteerism, and I definitely saw within NAFSA people who were really committed to, you know, taking care of international students and who thought about them. But there was not advocacy and policy formation, and in a sense that we needed to influence the government to think about national policies related, and none of that existed. And so I became involved with these people and became involved in NAFSA. Significantly absent at NAFSA were faculty.
Yes.
So again, it was, you know, these people that I just described. And I described them lovingly because I got to know many of them very well, and many of them have passed on, but they made real contributions. So if you think about higher education, especially in the United States, it's one of the last sectors of our economy to become globalized. You know, this happened in so many areas. So when this huge globalization started to take place in the 1980s, I would say, 90s, universities were not major players. Some of them were, of course, especially the land-grant institutions and ag-tech type schools, mostly through USAID, projects like that. But largely on the campus, nobody really thought too much about international students. I mean, they were glad to have them, but there was no recruitment, and there wasn't a lot of thought given about, you know, their broader contributions. There was little thought given to curricular relevance. I mean, they came to us, and here's what we offer, and you take these courses and you graduate, and so on. And so immigration policy was not something that we really thought much about. So that gradually changed, and dramatically. And so, and as those changes came, largely in the 1980s and into the 90s, some of it was triggered by the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was over, And I would say where governments were interested in international students, it was about Cold War issues, you know, winning
Yes.
hearts and minds and competing with the Soviet Union and so on. In fact, I can recall some NAFTA thing that we went to in Washington, and we were discussing U.S. sponsorship for international students and so on. And we were having this in the State Department, and President Reagan came into the room, and it was a big thrill for us, and all discussion stopped, and then he asked us to keep talking, and he just sat there, and I don't recall who said it, but I'll try to remember. But one of our colleagues, Nafson, said, well, you know, for every scholarship that the United States gives or provides, the Soviet Union provides 8 or 9. And Reagan just jumped up and
Wow.
got all excited and said, what, you know, they're out competing us and so on. And so there was, you know, this little flurry of activity that we pressed the right button
Right.
unwittingly. But it was all about competing with the Soviet Union and you know, making sure that young people came to the United States and thought like us, and so that when they rose to positions of authority and responsibility, they would buy American products, and they would be good capitalists, and they would be democratic and so on. Right. So that was about and I'm grossly simplifying here, but for the amount of time we have. But I would say that this Cold War competition was the thing that most interested our government, related to international education, if they thought about it as, you know, in the macro area. So anyway, so what happened as higher education became globalized, and as people became more interested in the globalization of our American students or domestic students, concerns about very few Americans speak foreign languages, that our students were not very globally sophisticated, that they didn't study abroad in the numbers that we would like. And so where would the next generation of Americans come from who would be able to penetrate new and emerging markets overseas, or who would serve in the Foreign Service, or would work for the CIA or whatever. And then there were some of these early symposia and publications like Global Imperative, A Nation at Risk, and some of these documents that started to come out, and where people began to look at what is the content, the global content, or the internationalization content of curricula in American universities, that sort of thing. So then I would say that marked the beginning of sort of the globalization and the professionalization of international education. And so on my own campus, for example, we were the first U.S. university to enter China after normalization of diplomatic relations, and we worked there, and the first Chinese scholars studied with us and in Beijing and
that was
Buffalo.
the first step to something humongous.
And it was the beginning, yes.
Yeah.
And then when they came on the campus, there were issues. And then one day I remember the president saying, well, you know, it's also fragmented. And we had a couple of issues with some Chinese scholars and that were embarrassing to us. And then the president said, well, you know, why didn't somebody do something about this? Well, there was no somebody to do that,
right.
You know. And some of the issues were on the academic side, and departments took international students and dropped them in and treated them like anybody else. Right. Yes, right. So then that was the beginning of the centralization at UB, University of Buffalo, and the president asked me to head up a little committee, and so we recommended that we should have a central office, and then the student services would come together, study abroad, and so on. And also we recognized we needed policies governing how we would take care of scholars on the campus, there was a proliferation of programs going overseas at that time, instructional programs, School of Management was teaching an MBA program in China, and it was the beginning of taking U.S. higher education overseas, and we recognized that we had no policies, guidelines, and so on. And so we wrote this little report, and then the president said fine, and he appointed me as the first vice provost for international education. And my job was to bring all of these units together. That took a little while because not all of them wanted to be centralized and so on. So, but at any rate, so it happened, and there were only a handful of us in this area. There was always a dean of international education at Michigan State, for example. Homer Higbee was, I think, the first one.
Right.
And I knew him. He was very kind and welcoming to me as a young person when I started, relatively young by this point, as we started to centralize, and gave me a lot of advice. And I'm very proud to say that I won the Homer Higbee Award,
yes.
and I always like to go and see people get that award, and I like to tell them that I knew Homer Higbee and what kind of a person he was, and indeed he was a remarkable person, and he left us much sooner than he should have. But at any rate, so I was the first in the SUNY system in this position, and now they're all over the 64 campuses.
Right.
And so that marked, I would say, the beginning of kind of professionalization. And NAFSA and AIEA. AIEA was rising up at that time and much more interested in these international officers and in getting faculty involved. And so training programs started, and within SUNY we established, which is very important in a state institution, as you well know, that there were designated positions, just like you had people in the counseling center, people in student affairs, and so on. So there are such titled lines.
And they're funded by
and
the
they're
institution.
funded by the institution, yes.
Right.
And that's absolutely right. In the past, well, as I said, in the past, a lot of it was done by volunteerism. So I see, this arc, and if I made some contributions, I'm very happy about that. I can only say that I really enjoyed what I was doing. It happened accidentally, and it was a kind of progression, but I didn't look forward so much. I just did what needed to be done at that time.
But you were creating a structure that didn't exist.
Exactly, yes. And now, for example, I sit in the cabinet, which is pretty common for people holding my position. And I would say it's taken for granted that as much as we have a vice provost for undergraduate education, for graduate education, for research, that there would be one for international education. And then we have a regular state budget, and I fight for the resources like all the others, and there's a voice about globalization, internationalization, and policies related to it, and we don't have to fight to get status, to get full-time positions for ESL teachers. They're viewed as important and as providing necessary services. And we've gone from 1,200 international students in Buffalo to 5,200,
Right.
and almost 2,000 studying overseas in a branch campus in Singapore. And again, this is all considered good, and presidents like to give speeches now about internationalization, and there's this whole corpus of research and faculty members talking about comprehensive internationalization and so on,
Right.
and so it's become part of the mainstream of the academic life and of the university itself.
Hans Dunnett has written that recent years that international education has moved from the periphery to being kind of an accepted, standardized, somewhat center of the higher education mission. And there is truth to that, as you described just now. It is also the case sometimes, though, that I wonder if the expression of mission, of an international mission in institutions' mission statements, is matched by the resources.
Yes.
Is that still an issue?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that up. So, maybe I painted a rosy picture, because it was rosy in some ways.
There is rosy, right.
But there's a side of it that's not so attractive.
Yeah.
And, Joan, when I come to conferences like the one we're at today, they increasingly look like trade fairs to me. Everybody is buying and selling, and that's fine. But if you go to the exhibits, you can see, and I'm not against, entrepreneurial approaches and so on, but I see a darker side to our field. A large part of it in the United States and Australia too, and perhaps elsewhere, is related to the recruitment of international students. And I'm sad to say that in many places, international students have become kind of cash cows, because as institutions, especially state institutions, if you take the United States as a whole, state institutions have lost 1/3 more, 40% of their state appropriations, especially over the last 10 years. And so higher education has become very expensive for domestic as well as internationals. But there's a sense, well, internationals will pay that, and you can see some, shockingly high tuitions being charged, and you can see programs, especially related to young undergraduate Chinese, that I think are not very attractive, where institutions have, grossly over-enrolled Chinese undergraduates and do not provide a lot of services for them. And so this is a darker side. I understand why it's happening, but it bothers me. I would also say that, as I said earlier, there was not a lot of professionalization or professional training. Well, now you see very little altruism. People look for careers in higher education related to international education or working with international students and scholars. And they don't stay very long, so you see these huge numbers of newcomers all the time. What happened to the old comers, because they generally leave after a while. So there isn't a lot of volunteerism within the professional associations, and it's very transactional, I would say, for a lot of folks. They come to the conference because they want something, and they want to learn something, and so on. But I don't know that. Now I sound like sort of an unhappy old man, because I'm not. But I would say that maybe this is healthy too, that it's so transactional. But I don't feel the same spirit that I felt when I was in that place at that time.
Being in the same age group as you, I understand what you're saying. In part, I think it was because we were mom and pop operations.
Yes.
And so with nothing.
We had to do everything ourselves.
We had to do everything ourselves, and we had to go find people who would be willing to help us, and we had no money.
Yes.
And it's very interesting, because it's probably paralleled in other fields, but as it became professional and as it has grown, I don't know the figure of growth in international students in terms of how much it's multiplied, but it's certainly grown exponentially.
Oh, yes.
It also, there's a side that's good and bad, and that there are efforts to maintain standards. There are the forums, activities with standards of behavior and ethical behavior in the whole field, or for them in education abroad, and AIEA has been very active in all of this. That also bureaucratizes and institutionalizes our structures at the same time as it does, in fact, raise quality in many, many areas. And so we are at a point where, we probably couldn't accept a volunteer because of liability issues, except for things like the old ComSec, the community volunteers who are a host family. Or not necessarily a host family where students live, but a host, a sponsor in that sense. So it has changed, and not all of it is necessarily what we would like, but it's there.
No, but I think you have put it in another perspective, that yes, it would be very hard for us to accept, especially in the whole area of immigrations and CVIS and all the tracking and the kind of environment in which you couldn't have people giving advice and so on like we had in the old days.
One area I do think, though, that there's still a volunteerism involved is being a part of the associations, of the professional associations. We're doing something that's volunteer right now.
Yes, that's right. You are, yes.
Right, and we're doing it. We may look like we're in a studio, but I can assure you we are not in a studio. So, and you and others and all of us certainly became incredibly active at NAFSA, and I know you had a very active role with AIEA.
I did, yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that
Sure.
organization and its development.
Well, actually, AIEA is rather interesting in its development, and I think others will speak to it better than I would or I can. But I knew Joe Neal. I met him in NAFSA, and in fact, I did when I became involved in NAFSA. I had my first professional training where they had these special grants where they would send you to an institution which was considered to be an example of best practices and so on. So I was sent to University of Texas at Austin, and I worked for a little while, a week or so in Joe Neal's office, and I learned a lot from him. He was a very interesting man, and certainly was I would say a mentor to me at that time. He gave me a lot of good advice, and we worked together over the years in other projects in Malaysia and so on. He was very eager for NAFSA to have a section dealing with this, and at that time NAFSA was mostly led by foreign student advisors, as they were still called, and they were not, frankly, that welcoming to having people, especially people who had a faculty background or were these faculty international leaders on the campus. I don't think they disliked them in any way. It was just they didn't.
They were dealing with different issues.
Exactly, and their issues were very important to them.
Right.
And they just didn't feel that they fit.
Right.
And Joe Neal kept pushing for this, even though actually he wasn't a faculty member himself. But he really wanted this to happen, and he also wanted the association to pay more attention to sort of sponsored programs. The project in Malaysia where we went to set up campuses and so on. So he liked these kind of big projects, and again, there wasn't big interest in it because it was more on the academic side of the house, offering degrees overseas and so on, doing training of faculty, etc., for a variety of sponsors. And so I think the association just didn't feel that they needed to do that, so he founded AIEA. And a lot of us belong to both, and still do.
Right.
And but I used to find sometimes that the AIEA conferences were a little bit more interesting to me because I was grappling with things, and at that time there were not a lot of chief international education officers on the campuses, and so I liked it because I could talk to especially the seniors. Because at that time I was still relatively young, so I found I learned a lot at those conferences and so on. And so as AIEA developed and matured and so on, and I became active and a board member and eventually a president one day. I didn't feel they were competing organizations. There was a period of time when we thought it might be nice to merge the two of them, and it didn't happen. I think people still wanted to keep AIEA relatively small, so that these kinds of interactions could take place, and so the organizations have become very similar in many ways, and NAFSA certainly has played an important role in advocacy and in dealing with the Hill, which is extremely important given especially the issues after 9/11 that we confronted. And I would say AIEA, to its credit, also has done good work there. So I guess there's room for more than one or two or three organizations, and if you look at the membership, they overlap.
Oh, yes, yeah. But it is interesting because it speaks to the expansion and professionalization of the field, and the multiple audiences there are within our field for a wide variety of topics in international education.
Yes, absolutely. And a wide variety of people. So going back to, sort of my complaining earlier about it's become a little bit too commercial, but one of the good things, especially about NAFSA, is that those commercial providers are very welcome and they get involved as well, and I think that it's a good experience for them as well as for us, and certainly I learned things from these people I like to look at their exhibits and look at the products or the wares
Right.
that they're offering. I mean, to me, it's just amazing. I can remember the first NAFSA conference where we had exhibits. It was in Washington, and I don't know when it was now. It was in the late 70s, I think. And we had to set up little card tables here and there, and I think we had like maybe 10 or 11 exhibitors. Yeah. And it was kind of hokey, but I did this with a fellow from American University, and this was our idea to do this. And I think we had like Hinchcliffe, International Health Insurance. We had somebody from ETS and maybe somebody from AIE, and I mean, it was in the corridors, and I think we charged them $10 or $15, and to be there.
Right.
And now look what it is today. And so when I walked through that exhibit hall, I still remember those folks and our fear that nobody would come. Yeah.
I noticed in my packet here, we're at the NAFSA conference. What year are we in? 2014.
Yes.
And perhaps this has happened in the past, but I noticed there's a whole separate booklet
Yes.
that is a guide
Exactly.
to the exhibit hall. It's
Yes.
stunning to see that.
Yes, it is, yes. And of course, it's become a very important revenue stream
Yes.
for the association as well. And AIEA, of course, followed in the same way. I worked on that with 2 or 3 people in trying to get exhibitors to come. And again, it's an important revenue stream. But putting aside the revenue stream, it's an important service that people can become aware of all kinds of instruments and products that will enhance what they do on the campus, and,
Right.
and make their lives better, perhaps, or enable us to serve our students better. So yeah, so I guess it's a mixed picture if we look. You started your question talking about resources. I would say that in a lot of cases, institutions that have these very nice mission statements and talk about internationalization, they don't always provide the resources that are required. I would say, for example, if I speak to my own institution, that they have been generous, but I've had to fight for every dollar I get, and I have to continually, be an advocate for why this is important, and point out the amount of tuition that international students are paying, and what would be appropriate services to give in return for that.
Right.
And generally, I would say, at least in SUNY Buffalo, and I think that's true in many other institutions, that they get that in the upper administration. But if you take SUNY, for example, we have lost 1/3 of our state appropriations since the meltdown on Wall Street.
Stunning, isn't it?
And yeah, I mean, that happened in just a few years.
Period of time.
And if I go back to when I joined SUNY in 1971, 83% of our operating budget came from the state of New York, and now it's probably around 40%. So over those 40 years, half of our state appropriation has disappeared.
Yeah.
Now, in the aggregate, our budget has grown, and it's $1.5 billion or whatever. But we've had to get that money elsewhere, and so I think we're coming to a crisis in the United States about, do we really want to fund public higher education or not? And is it affordable? It isn't. What does that do to access? And I would say that is deeply troubling. And I talk to friends and neighbors who tell me that they are not sure they can afford to send their children to even to a state institution. And so I worry about that if we look long term.
I think you bring up an incredibly important point, and that is that there's been a shift in this country from seeing education as a public good to seeing it as a private good, which means you don't have to fund it publicly.
Yes, exactly.
And that's very frightening. And at the same time, internationally, it's actually being seen more of a public good in some countries that we never would have expected for their purposes of development.
Yes.
So it is a transformational time, and it's not clear where things are going. And that leads me to the last question I have, I think, and that is, I guess the future of this whole idea of what international education is? Are there things that you see ahead? Are there things you would like to see ahead?
Well, I think one of the things that I would like to see, and I think it's happening, is the internationalization of the faculty.
Yes.
That's extremely important. We're on the border with Canada. We're in the process of rebuilding our medical school, moving it from the suburbs into the city center, closer to hospitals and so on, that sort of thing. And so we've been hiring, and when I look at who applies for the jobs and who gets hired, I see a lot of Canadians crossing over, but I see people being hired from all around the world because we do the immigration work and
Right.
H visas and so on. So the faculty have become very, very internationalized. And maybe that was always the case to some degree. But when I look also at the number of faculty-led study abroad programs, during our winter session we had, I think, 14 of them, all led by faculty. They were mostly younger faculty who are themselves already fluent in a foreign language, who've studied abroad and so on. I don't have to spend a lot of time selling study abroad and internationalization to the faculty who are getting hired today compared to some years ago. But then they were much more conservative about it. And I can recall deans who wouldn't take credit, allow transfer of credit from overseas because their attitude was if it wasn't happening in Buffalo, it wasn't happening.
Right.
And obviously there was very little you could learn, especially in STEM fields overseas.
Right.
Well, that's not the case anymore.
Right.
So I see that. So one thing that's a good trend. I wish we could get the numbers of Americans up a little higher in study abroad. That is happening to some degree. In fact, in my own institution, we recently brought in, as part of the reform of general education, a significant international education experience where every undergraduate will have some kind of international experience. The gold standard will be study abroad, but they will do that with a foreign language or that and some other activity, an internship or whatever. So I would like to see us get, well, you know, we went from 2% to, I think it's like almost 4%, but it's kind of sad when you think that that's the extent of participation. So I'd like to see it, we have a target in Buffalo for 20% for study abroad alone, and we're getting close, but it requires money. And institutions either going to have to subsidize a great deal more than they are, or I have to do a better job of getting sponsors and people to donate, and so that we can provide more scholarships. So I want more young Americans to go and study outside the United States, and we have to provide those opportunities. I think that's very important. I see certainly the globalization of how we deliver education, especially with online instruction. So there are people who are taking courses all around the world from Buffalo who may never come to our campus, and we are teaching more and having more joint degree programs with foreign universities. I think that's very important. So I think we still have quite a bit of work to do, but I would say that we're sort of moving in the right direction in all those fronts.
Well, I think that we have gotten to this point is thanks to you and people like you. And so it's wonderful to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you. And again, though archival might be a scary word because we tend to think of ourselves being archived, I think that conversation we've just had will be a great resource for people who look back and figure out where did we begin the 21st century with and how did we get to that beginning point.
Yes. So. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank you for your service as well.
Thank you.
And both to AIEA and NAFSA and for this project. And,
thank you.
And thank you for interviewing me today. I've enjoyed this talk.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.